They erased his records, his trophies, even his name. But they couldn't erase what he did on that strip.
Smoke fills the air. The crowd leans forward. A thunderous roar erupts as Don Nicholson's Mercury Comet launches its front wheels, clawing at nothing but air. In that instant, drag racing changed forever. But within months, this machine and the class it belonged to vanished from NHRA record books. No trophies, no official mentions, no legacy, just whispers of a car too radical, too fast, and too defiant for the rulemakers. This is the story of NHRA's biggest secret, the drag racer they tried to erase from history. The middle years of the 1960s were a time when American horsepower was running wild. Every weekend, drag strips across the country filled with smoke, noise, and fearless drivers who lived for one thing: speed. The National Hot Rod Association had become the heart of this movement. It was supposed to keep racing fair and organized, but what unfolded was far greater than anyone expected. Automakers such as Ford, Chevrolet, Dodge, and Mercury had discovered that winning on Sunday could sell cars on Monday. Behind closed doors, they began sending parts, money, and even secret engineers to independent racers. The goal was simple: build the fastest machine ever seen on a quarter-mile strip. What started as friendly factory support quickly turned into a secret arms race. To manage this wave of experimental cars, the National Hot Rod Association created a new group called Factory Experimental. On paper, it allowed small changes for performance testing. In reality, it became a playground for radical ideas. Builders were stretching wheelbases, replacing steel with fiberglass, moving engines backward for better traction, and running fuel mixtures that had never been approved. Crowds loved it. Every run was louder, faster, and more unpredictable than the last. These cars looked half stock, half alien, a mix of showroom style and pure invention. Each event felt like a glimpse into the future of drag racing. But for officials, that same excitement began to feel dangerous. The speeds were rising faster than safety standards could keep up, and the gap between factory car and purpose-built racer was disappearing. By the end of 1965, the factory experimental class had turned into a storm the rulemakers could no longer control. They wanted spectacle, not chaos. Yet chaos was exactly what they had created. And in that chaos, a quiet and brilliant racer named Don Nicholson was preparing to unveil the car that would push the National Hot Rod Association to its breaking point. Don Nicholson was not like most racers of his time. While others shouted for attention and lived for drama, Nicholson spoke through precision. People called him Dyno Don because he trusted data more than luck. Long before computer tuning existed, he was using dynamometers to measure every heartbeat of his engines. To him, racing was not about showmanship. It was about perfection. Nicholson's story began long before the 1960s. He started with local drag races in California, driving Oldsmobiles and Chevrolets during the early years of organized racing. His calm nature and mechanical skill quickly made him respected. By the time factory teams were forming, he was already known as one of the most dependable drivers on the strip. In the early 1960s, Nicholson joined forces with Mercury, a division of Ford Motor Company. Ford wanted to challenge Chevrolet and Dodge, not only on the streets but also on the track. Nicholson's technical mind made him the perfect choice to test and represent their newest ideas. While many racers simply drove what they were given, Nicholson improved what he received. He studied airflow, gear ratios, and tire grip with scientific care. By 1965, Mercury and Nicholson were quietly planning something bold. The company wanted to compete in the National Hot Rod Association's Factory Experimental category, the class where imagination had no limits. Nicholson believed that with the right design, he could create a car that would launch harder, run straighter, and reach speeds no one thought possible from a factory-based machine. But there was something else that set him apart. Don Nicholson was polite, humble, and deeply professional, yet under that calm surface was a man who refused to accept limits. He read every rule line by line, searching for opportunities others ignored. He never cheated, but he understood that innovation often lives in the gray area between what is written and what is allowed. By the time 1966 arrived, Nicholson and Mercury had built a machine that would test every boundary the National Hot Rod Association had ever written. It was sleek, powerful, and frighteningly fast. A car so advanced that it would change the future of drag racing itself. The world was about to meet the 1966 Mercury Comet Factory Experimental. By the beginning of 1966, the racing partnership between Mercury and Don Nicholson had reached a new level. Ford Motor Company wanted to make a powerful statement in drag racing, and Mercury was ready to lead the charge. The factory experimental category had become the center of attention, and the 1966 Mercury Comet was built to push that category to its absolute limit. The car began its life as a regular Mercury Comet, but almost nothing remained standard once Nicholson's crew started working on it. The wheelbase was moved several inches forward, a technique that helped transfer more weight to the rear tires during acceleration. This change allowed the Comet to lift its front wheels off the ground when it launched, a dramatic sight that thrilled fans and frightened officials. To reduce weight, many of the steel body panels were replaced with fiberglass. The windows were made from lightweight plastic, and unnecessary components were stripped away. Under the hood sat Ford's legendary 427 cubic inch V8 engine, the same power plant used in Ford's top racing machines of the era. It was tuned for extreme performance, producing more than 600 horsepower. The engine was paired with a manual transmission that required perfect timing and strength to control. Nicholson worked closely with Mercury engineers to refine every detail. The suspension was adjusted for perfect traction, and the car's balance was tuned for a clean, straight launch. Even the aerodynamics were considered. The front end sat high, while the rear was designed to plant firmly against the asphalt. The Comet looked wild, but every inch of it served a purpose. What made the project even more fascinating was the secrecy around it. These factory experimental cars were not publicly advertised or sold to customers. They were special builds created only for racing, often tested late at night or behind closed doors. Photographs were rare, and most of the design notes were kept inside company walls. Mercury's engineers knew that the Comet was no longer just a car, it was a prototype for the future of drag racing. When the 1966 Comet was finally revealed at the track, it looked like something from another world. The stance was exaggerated, the tires were enormous, and the roar of the 427 engine echoed across the strip. Fans had never seen anything like it. The Comet was ready to challenge not just its rivals, but the very definition of what a factory-backed race car could be. The stage was set. Don Nicholson stood beside his creation, calm and focused, knowing that what would happen next might change the sport forever. The 1966 season opened with excitement and tension in the air. Fans filled the bleachers, their eyes fixed on a line of new factory experimental machines that looked nothing like regular cars. But when Don Nicholson's Mercury Comet rolled up to the starting line, everything around it seemed to go silent. The car's stance was wild, its front wheels sat forward, its rear tires looked oversized and ready to explode with power. Everyone knew something special was about to happen. Nicholson climbed into the driver's seat, wearing his trademark calm expression. He had spent weeks tuning the car, studying every inch of the setup. The 427 cubic inch engine rumbled under the hood, its sound deep and angry. Mechanics double-checked the tire pressure, the fuel mix, and the clutch settings. The tension grew heavier with each passing second. When the starting lights came down, the Comet launched like a rocket. The front wheels lifted clean off the ground, hanging in the air as the rear tires dug into the track. The sound was deafening, a raw mix of engine thunder and burning rubber. The crowd exploded into cheers as the car tore down the strip, leaving a trail of smoke behind. It crossed the finish line in a flash, recording one of the fastest passes ever seen from a factory-backed car. But while the fans were thrilled, the officials were not. The National Hot Rod Association had been growing uneasy about these extreme machines. They were called factory experimentals for a reason. Every manufacturer was stretching the rulebook, creating cars that barely resembled production models. And Nicholson's Comet, with its shifted wheelbase and feather-light frame, seemed to go too far. After the run, whispers spread through the pits. Some said the Comet's performance was proof of pure innovation. Others called it an unfair advantage. Rival teams accused Mercury of turning drag racing into a contest of secret prototypes instead of real cars. NHRA officials gathered quietly to discuss what they had just witnessed. For Don Nicholson, that moment was one of pride and uncertainty. He had just proven that the limits of speed could still be pushed by human hands and raw engineering. But deep down, he sensed the winds were changing. What had started as a race to innovate was turning into a battle for control. And soon, the NHRA would make a move that would shake the entire sport. In the months that followed Don Nicholson's record-breaking runs, the National Hot Rod Association found itself at a crossroads. The factory experimental category had started as a playground for creativity, a place where manufacturers could test new ideas and racers could stretch the limits of performance. But by 1966, it had become something else entirely. The cars were no longer factory in the traditional sense. They were hand-built machines that looked like showroom models only from a distance. The Comet that Don Nicholson drove was a perfect example of this transformation. Its wheelbase had been moved to improve traction. Its weight had been reduced with fiberglass panels, and its engine had been tuned far beyond what any street car could handle. The result was incredible speed and a growing sense of discomfort inside the NHRA offices. Officials began to worry that the factory experimental class was drifting too far from its original purpose. Racers like Nicholson were not breaking the rules. They were simply reading them carefully and finding new ways to go faster within the grey areas. But that cleverness came at a cost. Spectators were starting to question whether the races still represented real-world cars. Sponsors worried that the growing gap between street and strip would confuse fans, and most importantly, the NHRA feared it was losing control of the competition it had created. So the decision was made. In late 1966, the NHRA announced that it would begin to phase out the original factory experimental category. The organization introduced new limits on wheelbase alterations, body modifications, and engine placements. They wanted cars to look more like what the public could buy from dealers, not like science experiments on wheels. For racers like Don Nicholson, this was a heartbreaking moment. He had invested months of effort, creativity, and passion into his Mercury Comet. The car had proven what human innovation could achieve when rules were treated as possibilities instead of restrictions. But now, that spirit of experimentation was being shut down. The NHRA's decision was final. The wildest cars, including Nicholson's Comet, were suddenly pushed out of competition. It was not a ban in words, but it felt like one in spirit. The association had drawn its line in the sand, and the age of fearless factory experimentation was over. Don Nicholson accepted the ruling with his usual calm grace. Yet behind that polite smile, he knew what had been lost. Drag racing would continue, but a small part of its daring heart had just been erased from history. When the National Hot Rod Association tightened its rules, the effects were felt across the racing world. The decision did not just end a category. It closed a chapter of pure innovation. The factory experimental era, once celebrated for its boldness, was now seen as a threat to order and fairness. What had begun as Detroit's laboratory for speed became a casualty of its own success. Manufacturers like Ford, Mercury, Dodge, and Chevrolet had used the factory experimental class to test ideas that would later influence street cars. Wheelbase adjustments improved traction. Lightweight materials showed what was possible in performance design. Supercharging and fuel injection experiments laid the groundwork for future muscle cars. But when the National Hot Rod Association imposed limits, those creative pipelines were suddenly blocked. Factories withdrew their direct support, and the spirit of experimentation began to fade. Don Nicholson was among the racers most deeply affected. His 1966 Mercury Comet had been one of the brightest stars of the class. But now it could no longer compete under the new guidelines. For a man who believed that progress came from pushing boundaries, the rule changes felt like a quiet punishment. He had not broken any laws, yet the very creativity that made him great had been declared too extreme for the sport he loved. Racers who had built similar cars faced the same fate. Many of them either retired their factory experimental machines or modified them to fit new categories like the emerging funny car class. These funny cars would soon take over the spotlight, using fiberglass bodies and supercharged engines to deliver the same wild excitement, but under a new, more controlled set of rules. In a way, funny cars were the spiritual successors of the factory experimentals, though with stricter oversight. Fans, however, remembered what had been lost. The factory experimental era had been raw and unpredictable, a time when every run felt like a discovery. It was not about corporate polish or perfect branding. It was about men like Don Nicholson, working late into the night with grease-stained hands, trying to build something faster than anyone thought possible. The end of that era marked the beginning of professional drag racing as we know it, safer, more structured, and less personal. But to the people who lived through it, the memory of those wild Mercury Comets, Dodge Darts, and Ford Fairlanes still represented something untamed. It was a reminder of when racing was driven not by sponsorships or regulations, but by pure human curiosity and courage. Although the National Hot Rod Association ended the factory experimental category, Don Nicholson's legacy did not fade away. In fact, The lessons learned from his 1966 Mercury Comet helped shape the next generation of drag racing. What Nicholson and his team achieved during that short, explosive period became the foundation of modern racing technology. After the factory experimental class disappeared, Nicholson turned his attention to the new funny car category. These vehicles carried the same wild spirit, but operated under clearer rules. Nicholson's scientific approach and precise tuning gave him an early advantage. He began winning again, proving that innovation could survive even within boundaries. His calm professionalism and deep understanding of mechanics earned him respect not only from fans, but also from engineers and fellow racers. The Mercury Comet itself became a symbol of that turning point. It represented the moment when creativity clashed with regulation, when speed met control. The car had shown that factory-backed performance could rival and even surpass anything built in small garages. Though its time on the track was brief, its influence stretched far beyond the mid-1960s. Many of the engineering principles tested on Nicholson's Comet were later seen in production vehicles and professional drag cars for years to come. Don Nicholson continued racing into the 1970s, eventually becoming one of the most respected figures in the pro stock category. He was known not only for his victories, but for his integrity and dedication to the craft. Even when technology advanced and computers began to enter the sport, Nicholson remained the racer who trusted data before it was popular, the man who understood engines by feel, not just by numbers. When he passed away in 2006, tributes poured in from across the racing world. Veteran drivers, engineers, and fans remembered him as a pioneer who had balanced professionalism with rebellion. His Mercury Comet may have been sidelined by the rulebook, but its spirit lived on in every racer who dared to experiment. Today, collectors and historians still talk about Nicholson's 1966 Comet as one of the defining cars of the factory experimental era. It stands as a reminder of what happens when innovation goes unchecked, and how that very freedom can sometimes be too powerful for the system that created it. For Don Nicholson, that car was not just a machine. It was proof that even within rules, greatness begins where imagination refuses to stop. Looking back today, the story of Don Nicholson and his 1966 Mercury Comet feels almost like a forgotten chapter of American racing history, one that the National Hot Rod Association never truly celebrated, yet could never erase. It was a time when racing was raw, fearless, and personal. A time when innovation came not from corporations or computers, but from men with wrenches in their hands and determination in their hearts. The Comet stood at the edge of what was possible. It was not built to break rules, but to explore them. It proved that creativity could turn a factory-built car. But that same creativity frightened the officials who guarded the boundaries of the sport. They feared that if cars like Nicholson's Comet continued to evolve, drag racing would lose its link to everyday machines and perhaps its control altogether. Yet, even after the National Hot Rod Association changed the rules, they could not change what had already been done. Nicholson's Comet had shown the world what human ingenuity could achieve without limitations. Every wheelie off the line, every cloud of smoke, and every roaring engine of today's funny cars carries a whisper of that era. The era when Don Nicholson and his Mercury Comet dared to go further than anyone else. For the fans who remember, the factory experimental years remain sacred. They represent the golden age of drag racing, when men raced not for fame, but for discovery. The tracks were simpler, the tools were basic, but the dreams were enormous. It was not just competition, it was exploration on asphalt. Today, few of those original cars survive. Most were scrapped, rebuilt, or lost to time. But the memory of the 1966 Mercury Comet lives on in photos, in the stories told by old racers, and in the archives of motorsport history. It remains the perfect symbol of an era when Detroit's bravest engineers and racers worked side by side, chasing something greater than trophies. They were chasing understanding, speed, and legacy. So the next time you see a modern drag racer launch down the strip, remember this: it all began with a handful of dreamers like Don Nicholson, whose machines were too fast, too clever, and too far ahead of their time. The National Hot Rod Association may have tried to erase them, but their echoes still thunder across every racetrack in America. If you believe legends like the Mercury Comet deserve to be remembered, make sure to like this video, share it with fellow car enthusiasts, and subscribe to Regal Rides, where history still roars.